Hi, 8th grade. Today, in this video, we're going to talk about James Madison's presidency and the War of 1812. We're going to be going over those questions that I assigned. So if you have a second, go ahead and pull those questions up and feel free to edit after we go through them. So the first question asks, explain President Madison's reasons for declaring war in 1812. Well, Jefferson pretty much dismantled most of the army and the defenses, and so there were some problems with the British on the Great Lakes. They still had forts. They were still encouraging Native Americans to launch attacks against American settlement. So they were giving the British were giving the Native Americans guns. This was definitely a big problem. And then besides the impressment of American sailors, the British were also trying to control American trade and set up a bunch of rules as to where the Americans could trade and where they couldn't trade. And really that was the final straw. And so we were ill prepared for a war in 1812, but a war is what we're going to get. And then next question, why did the Native Americans support the British in the War of 1812? And what were the consequences of that support? Well, here's the enemy that's close, and that would be the Native Americans viewed the Americans as enemies, and they were on that territory. And so they figured by supporting the British, they might further stop the incursion of the Americans into their territory. The bottom line is that most of these Native American tribes that supported the British in the end are going to suffer heavy casualties and are going to lose an awful lot of land. So in the end, it was a bad bet, but I don't think if they'd put their stock in the Americans that it would have been any different for them in the end. Here's the next question. What happened at the Battle of Fort McHenry in Baltimore? Boy, if you get a chance to go to see Fort McHenry, it is impressive. You can do tours, you can see just how massive the fort is. And the British are going to send in some of their most powerful bombarding ships, and they're going to bombard over the night this massive fort that really is a gateway or a seaway, I guess, port into Maryland and a way to meet up with troops that were marching on Washington, D.C. So the battle is going to be one-sided. The British are going to launch a lot of artillery, and the American fort is still going to be there in the morning, and the flag will be there. And I'm going to skip ahead and talk about Francis Scott Key since it's related, even though I'm skipping a question about Dolley Madison. Here, Francis Scott Key, an American, just is devastated to see this fort being bombarded, and he thinks there's absolutely no way that the Americans are going to be able to withstand that bombardment. But in the end, there's Old Glory up there flying, and so he was really inspired, and his contribution was to write a song or a poem that will become a song. It's called the Star-Spangled Banner, and it will become our national anthem much later on, though. What role did Dolley Madison play during the War of 1812? Dolley Madison, the wife of President James Madison, is very aware that the city of Washington is going to be destroyed by the British. This is a retaliation for the Americans burning the city of Ottawa in Canada. And so they're definitely going to take every opportunity for revenge in all public buildings. And so Dolley grabs a lot of the artifacts from the early Republic, especially a picture that's still in the White House of George Washington, a very famous picture. So a lot of bravery here on the part of Dolley. The troops are telling her, you gotta go, and she keeps grabbing things, and she grabbed as much as she possibly could. So Dolley Madison, definitely an American hero. The War of 1812, we don't cover a lot about the specific battles, especially since we have very little time with this remote learning. So I want to talk about this. There's a peace treaty that's going to be signed in 1814, the Treaty of Ghent, effectively ending the War of 1812. The British can't afford it. They can't afford the disruption of trade. They can't afford to have another expensive war. And because of what happened at Fort McHenry, and there's some other battles that happened with our Navy, the British are going to say, gosh, we can't afford a costly war. So here comes the Battle of New Orleans, which is way down south in Louisiana. And there's no communication. So this battle takes place in 1815, after the war was actually over. But that doesn't matter. Americans are still going to rally and have a song about General Jackson and the Battle of New Orleans. And, so Andrew Jackson is going to become an American hero. And the British suffer heavy, heavy casualties at the Battle of New Orleans. So the Americans are going to win that, even though it was effectively after the war was over, but no one told them. Let's see. Describe the peace treaty ending the War of 1812. The peace treaty pretty much resulted in everything going back the way it was, with maybe better relationships between the British and the Americans. They realized they had a lot more in common to establish trade. The British agreed to remove those forts finally. There were some boundary settlements in Canada as well. All right, what was the Hartford Convention, and what happened as a result of the convention? Here are a bunch of Federalists. Remember, they are not in power. They are struggling. They really represent the industrialized Northeast. They are opposed to the War of 1812 because they tend to be pro-British, and they don't want a disruption of the trade. Well, they form a convention, and it's called the Hartford Convention, where they discuss the possibility of seceding from the Union. That means to leave the Union. And so the War of 1812, one thing that it really does, and the biggest effect, is it rallies the Americans for a sense of national pride. And since the Federalists had been on the other side of that war, they're pretty much effectively done as a political party. And so they will go by the wayside. Next question. Why was the war considered the end of the Federalist Party? I think we kind of answered that question with the Hartford Convention as well. So we'll move on to the last question. How did the country change because of the War of 1812? Wow, much more connected, much more feeling, powerful as a young nation, having defeated the largest and strongest navies and armies in the world, not only during the Revolution, but the War of 1812. And so the Americans are kind of going to come out of this feeling really well, and it's going to launch what is called at this time the era of good feelings. And we'll talk more about that in our next video. Again, I hope that you were all well. I miss you. Shout out to a few of you guys there that have emailed me. Lane, you're doing a great job with the New Zealand now that we got you fixed up. And I hope you guys are all doing well. Take care. If you want me to give you a shout out, send me an email. Take care. Bye.